All right. Well, welcome everybody officially to the start of our fourth session. Hard to believe we're already at chapter four sessions in this exploration of Laudato Si. It's great to be back with you all, to everybody that's here in our seminar group and everybody that is out in the webinar space. It's great to be here with all of you, especially in this Holy Week, right? As we prepare coming up in a couple of days, to commemorate with the Triduum, the central mysteries of our faith. And as a liturgist and liturgical musician, that's how I get into the work that I do as a theologian. It's a very busy week for me, as I'm sure it is for many of you. We churchy types have a lot going on, typically this week. And I thank you for missing your local Chrism Mass, perhaps, to be with us tonight, or if it's celebrated on Tuesday in your diocese, or perhaps some people are there as well. But it's good to be with all of you in this great week and to be discussing chapter 4 of Laudato Si. So, as we have done in weeks past, we'll start out with a little group discussion here among our seminar crew of core insights, questions, concerns, things that emerged as we have read and reflected on chapter 4. Those will be a seedbed for our discussion. We invite people who are out there in the webinar space to please use the Q&A function as much as you can, as much as you wish, to bring in questions, comments, whatever it is that you'd like to contribute to our discussion. It's great. We've had such wonderful, rich responses from folks, and hope we'll keep that up as we go ahead. And then after, we do our sort of introductory part, I'll give my talk on chapter 4, which is the shortest of the chapters of Laudato Si. Hypothetically, that translates into a shorter presentation, but you never know. We'll see. And then we'll use the rest of the time that we have to discuss in further detail what's going on here in chapter 4. So again, welcome. Blessings on this Holy Week, and we will get started. So I want to open it up to our seminar group just to share, as we read and reflected on this fourth chapter here of Laudato Si, integral ecology, which is the basis for, Pope Francis's presentation of a set of solutions to the ecological crisis. What stuck out to you? What struck you? What do you bring into the room with you tonight? Questions, concerns? Bonnie, start us off, please.
Wow. Okay. Oh, whoops. Am I on mute? No, I am.
No, you're good.
Yay.
You're here.
Yay.
Yeah.
Yay. 144, 146, 150, and 152. Over and over and over again, he referenced, even though we want to find a solution, it can't be the same solution cookie cutter for everybody, because people in a particular area know best their area, their culture, their ecology. And so that was what really struck me. Yeah,
that's excellent. And that is such an important insight that has been part of sustainability discourse, especially what the UN, United Nations, calls sustainable development discourse. That's been going on for a long time, that really local communities know best what kind of solutions that they need. And we'll see this, and I'll say more about this as we get into it, but in the case of Laudato Si and Pope Francis's analysis of the ecological crisis, why that is so important is just what you said so well there, Bonnie, that it is a place where we see the intersection of what Pope Francis calls environmental ecology, economic ecology, cultural ecology. All of those meet in the needs of local communities, because there are cultures, there are ways of life, there are viewpoints on the world, especially among indigenous communities, that are often quite different from the sort of, Western European way of looking at things that holds sway in much of our society and certainly in our economy. So we'll dig more into that as we go forward, but I think that's such an important thing. And I love that you named those 4 paragraphs, because it is like a refrain in the latter part of this chapter, that sustainable solutions, integral, as he calls them, solutions to this crisis, begin at the local level. They must begin at the local level, because that's the only way that we can take stock of everything that's involved in a particular time and place and what we want to address. So I think that's a great place to start us as we get thinking about this. Thank you. We'll go over to Frank next.
Yeah, I was drawn to, I was reading paragraph 145, and in it he talks about the depletion of resources and how it affects culture. And I couldn't help but think of the situation in West Virginia where coal is no longer the way of life. And yet we see so many people, especially young people, who are addicted to opioids in a place like that because the whole culture is changing, and it changed so fast in a way that it made it difficult to adapt.
Yeah.
And the future didn't look as very good for many of them. So I think a lot still don't know where it's going. Anyway, that's what struck me today.
No, that's such an excellent example, Frank. And again, we see the intersection of environmental ecology, right, with mining practices and those kinds of things, but also what Pope Francis calls social ecology and economic ecology, right, in that first part, because, many of us know, probably all of us know, right, for West Virginia, coal was, as you said, Frank, not just a commodity, not just an industry, but a way of life. Everyone's sort of whole lives and livelihoods were oriented around this industry. And as that becomes, less and less used, and there aren't, and this is the key thing, I think, these infrastructural changes that say, okay, what's next for us in West Virginia? In the lag of that, there has been a collapse, in economic collapse, where people feel like they have their livelihood pulled out from under them. And that has led to, as we've seen, rising in the last 3 or 4 years, awareness of this opioid crisis, right? Where there's sort of a vacuum that has been created in people's lives in these once, coal mining areas, where folks have, collapsed into drug use and addiction and all these kinds of things that has been fueled, we know too, by certain forces in the pharmaceutical industry. But really this comes from a place of deep suffering and a feeling of deep absence, like everything that we knew, everything that we lived for, everything that was our life and livelihood is suddenly gone. So how do we account for those kinds of transitions? That's sort of a usually unconsidered byproduct, right? Maybe one of these law of unintended consequences of things like progress in an ecological kind of realm, because the more that we turn toward other sources of power, solar, right? If it's wind, if it's, other forms, there is going to be an impact that is an impact in the lives of real people who have worked in the fossil fuel industry. And it isn't actually the transition to solar that has driven this situation in West Virginia. But if it were, we would need to account for that. Can we train these workers? Can we value their dignity as people and as workers? And that's what Francis really drives at, right? In such a way that we don't just leave them hanging, in this position to feel like everything has been taken away, but actually find sustainable approaches to reintegrating them into the economy through an energy transition, right? Giving them new specialized skills, maybe not for mining, but for the maintenance and development of solar systems or whatever it is. We need to be able to think ahead enough to account for the human cost that is associated with this, because it is possible. And I think this is one of the great gifts of Laudato Si in this integral approach, right? Something that brings together everything. That we need to be thinking about not just the environment, not just our ecosystems, but the way that we live in relationship with those and the way that economic and social factors play in too. So as Pope Francis says at the very beginning, everything is closely interrelated. And the situation in West Virginia and the opioid crisis have been unfortunate, sort of symbols of that interrelatedness that I think we're still trying to kind of work through and work out. So I think, Frank, that's great. Thank you for raising that as well. Any other preliminary observations, things? Carol, please.
In paragraph 162, the last one in chapter 4, he goes into the rampant individualism. And that's such a part of our country's, rugged individualism. I think Robert Bellah and others in Habits of the Heart went into our culture, our westward expansion, from the East and everything was individualism and my family and not anybody else. So that common good or solidarity, especially even thinking of future generations, just isn't part of our materialistic culture that is trying to sell you products for your own satisfaction.
Yeah, Absolutely, Carol. That's such a great insight. And, you know, you make me think, first of all, I want to say, I wish that my undergraduates referenced the text as well and as often as you all do. It's so nice to have people be like, well, in paragraph this, he says this, and not just, you know, abstract speculation. So thank you for that. I really love that. And that's just a side note. But the other thing that comes up in my undergraduate classrooms a lot, you know, when we're dealing with 18, 19, 20, 21, 22-year-olds who are making their way through college and then planning to sort of enter the workforce and enter or enter graduate school or whatever, I think, Carol, what you point out is so important, that there is this very fascinating and deep set connection in American culture, United States culture in particular, between this individualism and what we've called in previous sessions the myth of progress, or the progress myth, this idea of expansionism and growth, right? It started out as expansionism across land from the east to the west, right, in the United States on what we call North America, and at great cost to our indigenous brothers and sisters who lived on the land, who were then forced onto reservations and whose lives and livelihoods were destroyed in ways not so different to what Frank was describing in West Virginia, but in a very different, more forcible way through that idea. The other thing that I think we don't often think about, and there's a lot here, and I think you're right, Carol, in that contrast between individualism and solidarity. There's a lot there also in thinking about how we imagine community and how we imagine ourselves in relationship to community, not just human community, but ecological community as well. And I would suggest, and this is kind of something I talk with my students about a lot, that, you know, the idea that when you turn 18, you got to move out of your parents' house and get out on your own and get your own car and your own house. And it's, you know, sort of socially questionable to live with your parents until you're, you know, 35 or 40. It wasn't always like that, one. And second, I think, what if we look at that from an economic standpoint? Well, what is it that we're doing when we, you know, push our kids out on their own, you know, throw them out of the nest or whatever it is at that certain point in their lives, and say, well, you got to make a life for yourself as an individual, right? Well, one of the things we're doing is that we're fueling a system of consumption, because those young people could be living at home with their parents. They don't need the apartments, right? So there's a consumerism in terms of sort of like needing to go out. We're also fueling the use of cars, because maybe there, you know, is the possibility of shared transportation or public transportation among members of a small community or a family, right? This is very practical stuff. But what accompanies this idea, the story that we tell about, you know, becoming sort of free and living on your own and your own individualism, making a life for yourself. And I'm not a parent, but I can imagine for parents, maybe there's like a lot of, you know, like desire to be like, it would be nice to have my house back, my life back for a little while, sure, right? But I also think that we are fueling certain patterns of consumption, right, at the same time, that say, when you go out and you get a place, you know, just for a few years, maybe until you get married and settle down, or you get your own car, you do all of that stuff that we do on our own, is also creating new opportunities for consumption and an increase in consumption, because you consume less when you consume communally, right? Things can be provided for. So waste is increased every time an individual consumer enters the equation, as opposed to people eating in community and you know, providing large meals. So if we look to religious life, right? If we look to you know, monastic life, these kinds of things, or even just like having groups of friends that eat together on a regular basis or share rides, rather than getting an Uber or getting a Lyft, call up a friend and say, hey, are you free to, you know, take me to the airport on Tuesday at 10? And if they are, next time, you'll give them a ride, right? And there's this sort of community building aspect to that sort of challenges this myth of individualism, I think, Carol, that you're talking about. And it builds a certain kind of solidarity, because that small community approach allows these opportunities for people and to come together and to be more closely kind of connected with the environmental ecological concerns we've been discussing in ways that challenge that sort of external capitalist pressure to consume and consume and consume and to live for oneself. And so I think, like, you know, invite everybody who's here as we talk about these things to imagine ways that we can all live in community more frequently, with friends, with family, with children, with whatever it is. Because I think, how can we build communities in our neighborhood, community gardens, whatever it is? There's so many opportunities. And I think you're right. And that the fact that he ends on that point, I think really emphasizes how important it is. And we'll say more about that as we go. So Carol, lots there to think about, both in terms of kind of how we imagine the world and in terms of our own practices. There's something to be said for community life. Yeah, and Bonnie mentions that, you know, intentional communities have been growing in popularity. Right before we started, Karen talked to us about, you know, a certain kind of, you know, intentional community that she'll be living in as well, you know, as we kind of think about these things. So yeah, imagining ways to be community, live in intentional community, I think is so good. Any other preliminary observations, questions, thoughts? Oh, go ahead, Colleen, please.
So building on what you said, Paul, and what Carol said, I'm indexing to paragraph 156 and 157, where Pope Francis talks about the common good. I think that's such an important principle to hold on to and to raise awareness. You know, it's kind of the opposite of individualism. You know, thinking about how our decisions, choices, daily activities not only affect ourselves, but how they affect others, how they affect the environment, you know, going beyond ourselves and our needs to understand the greater impact and the principle of the common good, I think is very important for understanding this integral ecology. I can very much relate to environmental ecology. I have a little bit of, you know, I'm not as familiar with economic or social ecology, but when I think about this principle of the common good, it kind of makes sense to me, because it's really an outreach to understand the impact that our daily decisions and activities have on others around us, others throughout the world, and the environment.
Yeah, that's so excellent, Colleen. And I love the focus you're putting in that on impact, right? And that really is what it's concerned, what Pope Francis is concerned about, what we should all be concerned about. You know, it's good to live, right, with good intentions. But, you know, as we say, you know, the path to perdition, right, is paved with good intentions. People, you know, intend good things all of the time. But really, if we focus on our impacts, if we focus on what our actions cause, what is produced by them, it reorients our thinking, I think, in a way that sort of causes us as people and as a society to kind of slow down and take account of everything that's kind of there. Remember, we talked last week about the true cost, or the real cost, right, of things. That idea is so good. And the second thing that I heard you say that I think is really insightful, especially for everybody who's wrestling with Laudato Si for the first time, is that this idea of integral ecology, it is a little vague. It is a little ambiguous in some places. And I think that framing an integral ecology in terms of the common good, which is a concept that's a little bit more concrete and sticky, you know, easier to understand, is a really smart move. So to say, you know, I may not understand all the dynamics of social and ecological and economic inequality and all those kinds of things, but I can understand what it means as a Christian to live in such a way that I live for a good that is greater than my individual self. I live for a good that is the good of my community, and I'm willing to give what it takes to follow Christ in the way of giving what I have for the good of what is beyond me. I think that makes a lot of sense to people, and that's really the basis for this idea of the common good. You know, there's the great story I think I mentioned before, you know, of course, in Acts, right, where, you know, Peter tells everybody in the early community to sell everything they have and bring it to the feet of the apostles, and they're going to distribute it according to need. And then Ananias and Sapphira, right, famously don't do that, and they both fall over dead in front of Peter. It's a great story in the first part of Acts, you know, because they didn't do what they promised to do. So that idea of giving what we have and then distributing it according to need, I think that's the really important part. And so often our patterns of consumption distribute things according to wants. They distribute according to want. They don't distribute according to need. In fact, the whole sort of American, financial system thrives on this idea of distributing according to what people want instead of need. And when we think about need, we have to think about basic needs, and immediately and first. And I think this is where the connection to preferential option for the poor and things like that kind of come into play. We should always be thinking about not just the needs of all, but the needs of the most in need, the needs of the poor, and that they they have a level of priority that is so important. And also, yes, Barbara, great point there in the chat, right? That when Ananias and Sapphira, right, lie, they lie under oath because they have said that they did it. So a second lesson there: don't ever lie under oath, or you might, in front of the apostles, might fall over dead too. Good. All right. There's our lesson for this Holy Week as we go forward. No. All right. Well, this is excellent. We've laid so much good foundation. I am going to jump in and offer my thoughts on this chapter, kind of walk us through it, give some commentary, make some new connections that hopefully will deepen and enrich our understanding of what Pope Francis is up to, and we'll do that. I may ask a couple of questions to our group here, just to invite people to jump in and offer a couple thoughts along the way. We'll see how all that goes. So, Integral Ecology, Chapter 4, that's our topic, right? The very first thing that this chapter introduces, and not really introduces, but reintroduces, because Pope Francis has been saying it throughout. In paragraph 137, that very opening sentence, we get this idea that, quote, everything is closely interrelated. And I think as a basis for this idea of integral ecology, what Pope Francis is saying there is that a multifaceted problem needs a multifaceted solution. And the ecological crisis that we are facing is a multifaceted problem. It's something that touches on every aspect of life in the world. And I don't just mean human life, I mean the life of everything. And so it brings together every aspect of existence. And so whatever the solution to that is going to be, and as we've seen in the previous weeks of this course, right, Pope Francis's deepest concern is not for piecemeal solutions. He just doesn't want to get technologies that fix environmental problems. He thinks we need to change our very deep ideas of what it means to be human in relationship to the world around us. And so an integral ecology is meant to be a resource for thinking through that, for thinking through all of those different dimensions of our life in the world and of all life in the world, that kind of brings together and offers a comprehensive solution to this multifaceted problem. So that's the goal of this integral ecology. Now, that word integral, I think, is useful in some ways. When I talk about this, one of the things that I like to say is, or one of the things I like to invite people to do, is to think about calculus for a minute. Now, who wants to do that, right? But to think about calculus. But we have this word integral, right? In calculus, maybe, I don't know, has anybody done calculus lately? An integral in calculus, right, whenever we talk about it and we plot it on a graph, right, one of the primary functions of an integral in calculus is to be able to calculate, anybody got it in our seminar group, this thing that I'm gesturing toward? It's the
area under the graph.
Yeah, the area under a curve, right? And so we've got a curve here. And so an integral in calculus is meant to give us everything. And what's so neat about an integral is that it can give us the area under a curved line, which is a lot more difficult and complex than giving us the area under a straight line. So when Pope Francis uses this word integral, I always think of doing an integral in calculus, wherein we are calculating the response that is needed to account for everything that is under the curve of our existence, everything, right? And not just any one part of it. And so the way that he breaks this down, right, is into these basic categories: environmental, economic, and social ecology, cultural ecology, the ecology of everyday life. And finally, as we've already discussed, he then applies this by turning to the principle of the common good and the idea of intergenerational justice and solidarity. So that's how he breaks down this idea of an integral ecology. And he starts that discussion then by talking about environmental, economic, social ecology, right? And there's this really neat note right at the beginning of that section where he says, ecology is the science of relationships, right? Ecology is a science that studies relationships. And there's a way in which the word ecology itself kind of gives this to us, because the Greek root of ecology is this word oikos, which anybody know what that means in our group here?
Oh,
Yeah, household, home, right? That kind of thing. So the subtitle of Laudato Si, on care for our common home, right, is like on care for our oikos, on care for our home, right? And that is the root word of both ecology and economy. So in their sort of more ancient forms, these concepts of having an ecology or an economy were viewed as sort of understanding the household dynamics. That's what ecology tries to do. But of course, the household in an ecological sense is not just what goes on in our immediate home, right? It is what goes on in the larger household, the household of creation, of which everything is a part. And so when we talk about that, I think it's really an interesting kind of invitation that's implied there by going back to this idea of ecology as the science of understanding our household relationships, so to speak, right? Because if we think about ecological care or social and ecological care in terms of taking care of our home, well, home is a place where family lives. Home is a place where community lives. Home is a place where everybody has a spot at the table. And if we could imagine our world in those terms, on care for our common home, on care for our oikos, right? I think there's really, really, really wonderful imaginative resources in that for thinking about this. And, on this point, just to quickly, quote another religious leader, the Dalai Lama, in his writings on ecological responsibility, he frequently talks, because he likes to say everything is simple. Care for creation is, he says, quote, just like taking care of your house. You try to keep your house in order, you try to kind of keep things nice, and you provide for your family and your home. Well, that's a great analogy, a great metaphor for what ecological and social responsibility is really all about. It's just like taking care of your home, and I think Pope Francis, especially with that subtitle, is saying kind of the same thing. So here, Pope Francis presents this by saying that, ecology is, quote, the relationship between living organisms and the environment in which they develop. That's how he defines it. And here, I might just push Pope Francis a little bit and say, let's also emphasize the indispensable function. This is something we talked about last week, that these so-called environmental factors like water and rocks and other things provide. Because we have to keep in mind, right, that water, while itself not living, is a habitat, is a source of life, is necessary for the existence of life on Earth. Rocks are a habitat, right? So again, suggesting this sort of approach that I've talked about before, an ecocentric approach that thinks in terms of the relationships between all of these different factors, including us, I think gives us this sort of encompassing way to sort of put some words around what Pope Francis is driving home, that everything is interrelated, and that this home that we're talking about, this creational home, is bigger than any of us and than any of our individual selves. So I think he's pushing us to think about that. And here is where this idea that we were just talking about, this wonderful, of impact enters in. Because Pope Francis says, right, if we could frame our thinking, if we could frame our vision in terms of this ecological or ecocentric point of view, that's my word there, then there would be deep, lasting ethical consequences of that, because we would naturally be inclined toward thinking about the impacts and taking stock of all of the conditions that are necessary for life to flourish in all its forms, in whatever area we humans are inhabiting. So we might recognize more deeply, as he says, the interconnectedness of atoms, of time and space, of species and chemical and biological processes, right? And that might lead us to think differently about things like development and production and consumption as well, because we would see, like in that act of buying a banana that we've been talking about, the real cost, all of those interconnected factors that unite the social and the economic and the ecological under that one curve of an integral ecology. So that's what he's suggesting. And it's a way of thinking that focuses us on impact in a way that then leads to a heightened awareness and a heightened need for both social and ecological. Integrated way of leads to an integrated way of living Because if fragmentation brings about fragmentation, then integration leads to this holistic, integrated way of living in the world. And so all of this, again, is about relationships, right? Paragraph 139 really dives into that and drives that point home in a wonderful way. And, so if we're thinking about, the shift in the title of this program from vision to practice, I might invite, you all to think about, or maybe share, if you work in education or faith formation context, or if you preach, if you do any of these kinds of things, right? There are some questions that I think we can ask out of this line of thinking that Pope Francis is proposing, like asking third graders, what kind of actions do you think would produce this worldview that really kind of, let me say that again. What kind of actions, right, might result from seeing the world as God's beloved creation and integrating all of these different parts of our existence in the world into a way of living as Christians? I think even little kids can offer great insights into that kind of thing because they perceive the world with this sort of holistic kind of understanding. I love being out in the dirt. I remember as a kid, you'd be out in the dirt playing with bees and, plants and all this kind of stuff. What if we ask these questions in these contexts to sort of invite these, ways of thinking? What if we could reorient our thinking even to see the world from the perspective of a bee? Right? I always love, and I remember talking with, my mentor, Beth Johnson, about this stuff. We have the Easter Vigil coming up, and we're going to hear, if you go to the Easter Vigil, that in the Exultet, that language of the mother bees, right? In the opening, with the wax for the candle, and that this is a gift that creation has given to us. What if we could imagine the creation of that Paschal candle from the perspective of a bee? Who contributed to the production of the wax that was used, and they see it there and they say, look what we did. We gifted the humans this candle that they can use for their ceremony, that they can use in their liturgy. What if we could see, the world from the perspective of the mountains, or from the perspective of a river or a fish swimming, right? What if we could imagine our interrelatedness that deeply, so that we start to see things from the perspective of other creatures, knowing that all of those creatures, even a little fish, even a little, bug, whatever it is crawling around, is beloved of God, one, and second, serves a function in the broader ecosystem, our broader household, our oikos, that unites all this together. I think these are the kinds of challenges that an integral ecology, with this sort of broad-based umbrella kind of approach, is trying to invite us to consider. And so already kind of trying to mine out some of the riches of this idea of a way of seeing and a way of acting that results from this kind of way. Hopefully that all makes sense so far. So Pope Francis, right, in emphasizing all of this, going on into sort of paragraph, 139, starts to emphasize more and more, and he said this before, he's saying it again, the way that natural systems and social systems intersect. And one great resource that I've found in my own research, coming from a scholar named William Rees, who thinks, has done a lot of work on this, is to use the word, rather than ecological and social, to frequently use the word socio-ecological in thinking about these things. This is a simple word thing, but by using the word socio-ecological, we kind of push our minds to think about the social and the ecological implications, impacts of our actions together. And I would suggest, and I think this is what Pope Francis is suggesting in here in paragraph 139, 140, right? He says, we don't have two crises on our hands, one ecological and one social. We have one crisis that includes both ecological degradation and poverty, threats to the dignity of the land and threats to the dignity of peoples, and so on. We always, by thinking socio-ecologically, are guided toward that integrated or integral kind of thinking that I think this chapter is really trying to promote. So I invite you to think about that word. I invite you to use that word, as you teach and as you think and as you reflect on this, to keep in view that idea from all the way back in chapter 1 and chapter 2, right? That an ecological approach, as Francis says, always becomes a social approach, so that we can hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, right? And to hear those two things together and to address them and respond to them meaningfully together and not in separation. So I think that that's really crucial. Now, Francis also says, and I think this is a really important point for people of religious faith who often, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, live in this tension between science and religion sometimes. He says in paragraph 140 that this elicits a great need for scientific research into how ecosystems work, not for its own sake, not just to understand how things are, right? But because, he says, quote, once we become conscious of this, many people realize that we live and act on the basis of a reality which has previously been given to us, paragraph 140. And I think the idea there, right, is that we are not of our own making. Our existence is a gift. You know, theologically, our existence is a gift from God. We are composites, as Genesis 2 presents us, of dirt and breath, right? Dirt and breath commingled, you know, into our existence. Ecologically, we are composites of water and air and food and all of those things. And we are caught up in those systems that include everything that is. Again, we might think about this as being living in a household that is bigger than us, living in a household to which we belong rather than we own, right? So we belong to this household. We don't own this household. So thinking about the ways that we're implicated and integrated with all of these kinds of things, I think is one of the fruits that Francis sees of this scientific research, because by understanding the world ecologically and socially, socioecologically, we also come to terms with the ethical implications, the call to action that results from that kind of way of seeing. But he observes in 141, our economic systems and our social systems aren't really structured to think in this way. They are focused, as we've already said, on consumerism, on consumption and on profit, not on long-term sustainability, not on the common good. And I think this recognition is really important on Francis's part, because it really drives home the point that to live according to this call, which he sees as the call of the gospel and the call of scientific insights into ecology, to live according to that call is to live in a way that is deeply countercultural. You know, it runs counter to almost all of the unconscious and conscious economic and social pressures that we face in our everyday life. The world is not set up in this way. And I think reminding of ourselves of that every morning, you know, when we get up and we begin our everyday lives, can lead us to think very deeply and carefully about the decisions that we make and our sort of unintentional complicity, participation in systems that do harm to people and to lands. Because, you know, that recognition that our systems are not set up this way kind of calls us to account for that. And so I invite you to think about that. I invite you to consider that, you know, how does this shape, how does this sort of pressures weigh on me and weigh on my family and weigh on my community? And how can I live in harmony with this bold cultural revolution, right, that we talked about last time, that Pope Francis calls for, which is a transformation of our systems, transformation of our way of living that is really countercultural and really pushes against, you know, all of these kinds of ideas. Even sometimes our idea of sustainability, where we think we've invented the idea of sustainability, but like we said last week, nature invented the idea of sustainability. Nature tells us what is sustainable. We don't decide what makes things sustainable. Nature does that on its own. And so we need to be listening. We need to be attuned to the rhythms of nature, to the world around us, so that in some ways nature, right, deriving from this conclusion Pope Francis makes, governs the economy. It sets the pace for what we call growth, right? That almost always in our contemporary world means that we're gonna have to slow down and rest and stop trying to control everything and let nature guide our idea of what innovation or intervention is. We have to work with the world around us because, again, it's our home, right? And not work against it. That is a radical, if not, I might say, heretical idea in sort of the traditional way that we imagine reality in sort of our American capitalist society, so oriented toward profit and rapid growth and all of those kinds of things. There's not a lot of room for rest on Wall Street, right? And we know this, but do we actually take that to heart? and then ask what the implications are for our Christian life. I think that is the real deeper call that Francis is kind of pushing us toward. And we're going to see more of this in chapter 5 and 6 as he goes into this. So all of this, he says, paragraph 142, leads to solidarity. That idea that we've already talked about today. It's going to be the theme basically for the rest of the chapter. And that this is a solidarity with the poor, and it is a solidarity with creation. Again, both at the same time, socio-ecological, not one or the other, right? But both have to be considered together there. And Francis in paragraph 142 here, expresses a concern for what he says, what he calls, quote, a consumerist vision of human beings. Now think about that phrase for a minute. It's not just a consumerist vision of wood or water, these things we call natural resources. There is also a consumerist vision of human beings that leads to the exploitation of the poor, who Christ calls the least of these. And it's very easy to forget that many practices that we have as an economic, society, like the outsourcing of labor, for example, send your labor out because you can pay people in Indonesia a lot less than we have to pay them here, also produces huge ecological, right, costs, because there are not the same sort of environmental regulations in many countries in the global south that we have here. Now, some of them have better environmental regulations than we do, so I want to name that too, right? But it is often the case that we just can outsource our labor, right? But what we're also doing is outsourcing our dirty production, and we are polluting and we are destroying another country's ecosystem, another community's ecosystem, and we are bringing disease and we are bringing, all sorts of degradation to those environments. And that's really sad to think about when we have in Catholic social teaching this principle of solidarity and this principle for a preferential option for the poor, right? The outcomes of outsourcing run directly against, those kinds of practices. And I think it's important to be able to kind of think about that. A second example that Pope Francis gestures toward in paragraph 144, and when he starts to talk about cultural ecology, has to do with indigenous communities. And in my research, the way that I've seen this show up is that there are sort of two primary industries that interface with indigenous community rights. They're the pharmaceutical industry and the cosmetics industry. And the reason for this is that indigenous communities traditionally, especially in South America, but also here in North America, have deep ancestral ties to plants, have deep ancestral ties to the land and to the production of land and these things. And they also have deep senses of what kind of plants have health benefits and, what kind of plants are good for cosmetic use. I mean, there's this whole history around this, right? But because indigenous communities are not protected in terms of having intellectual property rights, for example, to the sort of medicinal uses of a particular plant species that they've been using for thousands of years, right? Companies can come in, pharmaceutical and cosmetic companies can come in and basically raise the ground and take all the plants and say, hey, thanks for letting us know that this was really useful as an anesthetic or really useful as whatever it is. We're just going to take that for you, and there's no benefit to your community whatsoever because your rights to this land and to this commodity, right, the plant or whatever it is, are not protected. And so what Francis says is in these cases, right, what he is implying and pushing us to recognize is that there's a violation of the dignity and the integrity of the culture that happens there. This is what we call cultural appropriation, right? But we are taking from an indigenous community not only their knowledge, but also the resources that are part of their cultural rituals, that are part of their existence, and putting them to use in service of an industrial paradigm that seeks then to produce more rapidly and to, and has even led, back to Frank's point, to things like the opioid crisis, right? And so this connection with culture, this connection with indigenous communities and all this kind of stuff, Francis really drives that home in 144 and 145 and calls us to account for that as we think about this. So if that is kind of the problematic as we're talking about it in terms of, social and cultural ecology, economic factors, ecological factors, then I think it's important then to start kind of looking to the other side, which is things like the principle of the common good, the principle of subsidiarity, which maybe some of you all are familiar with from Catholic social teaching, which is that idea we were talking about that, you know, decisions should be made on the sort of local level, on the localist level, to put it in those terms, the most local level. That is the right place for these decisions to be made because people know what they need. People have this knowledge, and this is the basis for what the UN, United Nations, again, calls sustainable development, development that happens from the bottom up, rather than the world superpower coming in and saying, oh, you got problems, we've got solutions, let us impose our industrial or cultural or economic paradigm on you. That rarely works. So this idea of subsidiarity is about starting from the local level and letting things grow up, just like plants, you know, grow up with their roots in the ground and then flourish kind of above the ground out of that seed. The seed is already planted in the local community. What if it were the duty of people and communities, countries, governments, whatever it is, with the wherewithal to bring about the flourishing of these communities, to draw that out and to seek that flourishing by giving them the resources they need to enter the economy and to be ecologically responsible on their own terms, respecting their culture, respecting their tradition, all of that. That's all wrapped up on the positive side of this cultural ecology piece. And, you know, as I was reading this today, in particular, paragraph 146, my mind went back to when I taught on Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota for 2 years with the program Teach for America. And I'll never forget, within the first week, I think, of being out there, or maybe the second week, a member of the Lakota community, the indigenous community there, that I had already kind of started to bond with, came up to me and he looked at me and he was sort of like, you know, Paul, we are so tired of white people coming into our community with solutions. You know, that's what he said. He was like, we know what's good for us. We have a culture, we have traditions, we have problems too. But what we want with people coming in from the outside, because that's what this program did, like so many social justice programs, brings people in from the outside. He said, we want people to get to know us and our culture and our customs and to listen and really just to be attuned to our voices. And then to say, well, here's what I think I can bring to the table. And then to ask us, and I think this is the most important thing, does that work for you? Will that be a useful contribution? Not to make the assumption that I've got the answers because I'm educated and whatever, right? But to come into this community and listen, and then to ask, you know, is this what you need? Can I contribute in this way? And that had a huge impact on me and how I understand things. And I can't help since then in my research, when I think about indigenous cultures and traditions, to reflect on the fact that most indigenous communities around the world also asked permission of animals and plants before they used them. And that somewhere there's this connection between him saying, you could ask us first what we need, and this ancient custom among their cultural custom, among the Lakota and many indigenous communities, of asking permission of nature, asking permission of our plant and animal, you know, brothers and sisters before using them. I just think, what if we did that? You know, what if our consumer society stopped and said, you know what? I feel like I need to get the permission of this plant or this tree before I cut it down or use it. You know, it's a very different way of looking at the world. And there's a gratitude and a sense of giftedness, I think, that comes through there, that and to give thanks. Thank you, Bonnie, as well. And to give thanks, right, after, you know, as we use it, that is so crucial to this too. Yeah. So I was touched by that. It came back to me as I was reading that chapter, or those couple of paragraphs on indigenous communities. All right, so home stretch here to kind of bring this stuff together. The last section that Pope Francis presents is the section on what he calls the ecology of daily life, everyday life considerations. And the basic idea here, the central idea developed through this section, is that everyone has a right to the conditions necessary for a healthy, good life. And as I was reading this, I was thinking about that idea of everyone. For Francis, it's mostly focused on humans. It's mostly focused on the dynamics of sort of social, environmental relationships. But I also wonder if that everyone can be expanded to include, again, animals and plants and others, that everything and everyone has the right to that. And here again, I think indigenous wisdom is so important because there is this understanding that if you care for the whole, right, rather than the individual, back to Carol's point earlier, right, if you care for the whole, you're also caring for the individual. If you care for the greater good, for the common good, you too will be taken care of. Nature will provide for us. You will provide for others. Others will provide for you. It reminds me of Jesus, right? Saying when he sends out not just the apostles, but the disciples, go out and just please, this is all you have to take. You don't have to take much. You don't need money. You just need a staff and a cloak and go out and walk. Your needs will be taken care of if you care for others, right? And in the Passion narrative, right, that we just heard last week, he even asks the apostles that, right? Was there ever a time when your needs weren't met whenever you were out doing the work that I asked you to do? And I think about that as a paradigm for how we live in the world. And I think there's a really beautiful resource there as well. So in the midst of poverty, in the midst of ego, in the midst of self-centeredness, there is this call to live for the greater good, to foster this we, right? Not an I, but a we of solidarity and of equality in which everyone is cared for and made to belong. And he says this includes the unhoused. This includes people who lack access to affordable food and clothing and all of these kinds of things. And I think in this case, centering the needs of the poor and the marginalized and opening up the possibility of this other world where there are no poor and marginalized people because everyone is made to belong. And we find a way to do that is the deep moral challenge of this idea of human ecology. Now, even as I say that, I can't pass over paragraph 155, which many people flag as a point of concern. My students are always jarred by this. They're sort of like, why is this here? Where Pope Francis raises the question of the acceptance of our human bodies and our masculinity and femininity, and implicitly rejects transgender experience in this paragraph. My students, because this is more and more a question and a topic of discussion for young people, are often really struck, not always positively, by the inclusion of this here. And the way that I would look at it is this. I mean, his logic, Francis's logic, is that if we can't value our own bodies as God has given to us, how are we ever going to value the rest of the world outside of us? And perhaps, that is something that we need to consider. I would say at the same time, and this is something that my students have really challenged me to think about, with all due respect to that position, I wonder if there's a lack of recognition of certain elements that are really important here. One is that transgender women of color, this is sort of a statistical thing, have been at the head of most social and ecological movements. Black Lives Matter, as well as various eco-justice movements, especially around environmental racism. And I'm like, there's a sort of lack of recognition there on one hand. I also might suggest, in light of this call to solidarity and all of this talk of this we and marginalization and poverty and oppression, right? That in the midst of that maybe there is something in the experiences of women and LGBTQ plus people, of communities of color, of historically marginalized groups, right? Both in church and society, that puts those folks into contact with suffering and with struggle in a way that activates a genuine compassion and an expansion of compassion. And I can only imagine that the care that communities give, in the midst of these really unthinkable hardships. Like, I can't imagine what it's like to be a transgender person. I just have no idea what that could be like. And to me, that provokes a deep, genuine compassion, a drive to say, how can I understand this more fully? How can I listen more fully to this? Maybe there are ways in which the people that this passage sort of implicitly excludes can actually teach us a lot about what it means to care more deeply and to accept in love, in more radical ways, the whole world around us. So that's a different way of reading the same idea. Rather than saying, if we can't accept our bodies, how are we going to accept the world? I would say maybe these people who have experiences that are unfathomable to most of us can actually teach us a lot about what it means to love more fully and more radically. I don't know. But that is something that comes up every time I study Laudato Si with students. And I wanted to share that. I couldn't just pass over that here because it is kind of a thing that jumps out in this section on human ecology. All right, so last comment then, all of this brings us back to the common good. All of this brings us back to this idea of respect for the human person, basic rights and security, the principle of subsidiarity, right? Caring for local communities. And Pope Francis drives this point home very, very directly. Paragraph 158, I'll just read this quote. He says, "In the present condition of global society, where injustices abound and growing numbers of people are deprived of basic human rights and considered expendable, the principle of the common good immediately becomes logically and inevitably a summons to solidarity and a preferential option for the poorest of our brothers and sisters." And I just want to say, like, preach, Francis, right? Like that is the message here, that is not just a recognition of poverty. You know, we live with poverty. We see this all the time, but it is a summons to solidarity, a call to that preferential option that goes, that turns into a call to action here. And so, you know, while, you know, more radically, you know, I think this should, you know, make us on the one hand uncomfortable with poverty, right? But I think that most people at least would say that they're uncomfortable with poverty. I think the more radical challenge is that it also kind of makes us uncomfortable with wealth. It makes us uncomfortable not with wealth as a status thing necessarily, maybe, but also with wealth as an idea. You know, that sort of material wealth, when other people are suffering in poverty, should make us very uncomfortable. And that is the real, like, drive the stake in the heart, you know, kind of idea of solidarity that I think is here. And again, I keep coming back to this idea of teaching this to kids. I never learned this as a kid. I never learned Catholic social teaching and solidarity until I was maybe in high school or older. Well, by then our worldviews are so set, they're already so in formation, right? Can we teach solidarity to children at a young age? Can we preach this solidarity from pulpits? Can we build programs in our communities about solidarity in ways that create that good discomfort that leads us kind of to enter into more into these realities and activate them? And all of this then comes together, right, with this idea of intergenerational justice, recognizing that there will be a beyond this moment for our world. And no short-sighted piecemeal solution is going to get us there. We need to be looking to the long-term future of our planet and not using the sort of idea of future generations to put off action, but to say we need action now so that we have a beautiful, inhabitable, just, sustainable, wonderful world, glorious, good world to give to the people and the animals and the plants that are going to be the ecosystem that sustains us, the oikos of the future, right? That is the call to intergenerational solidarity and how all of this, I think, comes together. So that's my commentary on this chapter. I hope that kind of unpacks, enriches, raises some questions and ideas. And I invite everybody who's out there to please make any questions or comments using the Q&A function. Love to hear from folks as we go. And so I'm going to open it up now to the room, to our seminar group here, and we will discuss and we'll bring in along the way the comments of those who are out there as well in webinar land. Barbara, please start us off.
It seems to me that one of the radical implications of integral is a critique of categories that are tight, like Aristotle's and Thomas's, that have so dominated our thinking. And I wonder if the Pope and his helpers with this document meant to really say to us, this is a time to really rethink our absolute acceptance of hard edges, because integral ecology and all the things that you've been talking about, including paragraph 155, well, not including that one, critique hard edges. That paragraph seems to say, well, no, if you're this, then you're that. And if you have that kind of a body, you're that. It seems like his most radical thing is to say, don't believe those categories as firmly as we have done our tradition. Aristotle and Thomas. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I completely agree. I resonate with that a lot. And I think that is one of the things that even though, say, under my undergraduates or something like that, or even my graduate students might not have this sort of deep knowledge of Aristotle and Thomas and the way that the Catholic tradition has reified their thinking into sort of absolute, kind of truth with these hard edges, as you're saying. I love that image. Even though they don't have that knowledge, I think that is what makes that paragraph 155 jump out to people so much, because they see this call to a radical transformation and a radical openness to new ways of thinking and living, and this sort of questioning of the hard edges of capitalism and consumerism and all of that kind of stuff. And then that paragraph on gender comes in and kind of is like a slap in the face. It's like, wait a minute, like, what is this doing here? I thought we were moving in a different direction. But I do think in principle, what we are seeing is a really, really, really strong. I've often in just side conversations with colleagues and things like that, talked about Francis's papacy as a papacy that is about loosening knots. He's not untying knots, but he's loosening them. And I sometime I want to write on this, but I don't know what the article would be. But Francis is somebody that is loosening long tied knots, I think, is an interesting way to imagine a lot of what his papacy has been about. Now, while also recognizing that typically when he speaks on gender, he holds to the party line, what has been the magisterial position, which is aligned with the thought of Aristotle and Thomas. And it actually derives, as many of us know, right, directly from their thinking. So I think that there's a tension there, Barbara. That's what I would say. And I'd be interested to hear what others think, or be happy to open it up to a different line of reflection too. All right, how about a different topic? How about a different line of questioning or something else? Carrie, please.
Today talked about Indigenous people, and I think about them, and you mentioned their love for their land and their plants and the water and everything that comes from that. We being individualisms, we look at our generation and maybe the next generation, but Indigenous people look out 7 generations to what their impact and what their decision is going to not only mean for the next couple of generations, but 7 generations out.
Yeah, that is so powerful, right? Talk about intergenerational solidarity, right? Not to think in terms of, just the next generation, but 7 generations. And that makes me think, as you were saying that, Carrie, about Bill Mckibben, the environmental writer, maybe people are familiar with his work, Earth, and he's the founder of the 360 Project and all these different things. He in some of his work talks about this idea of the grandchildren problem, I think is what he calls it, where for so long ecological discourse was we need to create a solution so that our grandchildren can live in a good world. And this idea of grandchildren, well, he's like, well, on the one hand, that kind of is nice, you want to hand a good world onto your grandchildren, but it also forestalls action in the present, because it's sort of like, let your grandchildren take care of it, right? And he goes on to say, this isn't a problem for our grandchildren. This was a problem for our parents, and we already weren't taking care of it. So I imagine that, what you're talking about with, Indigenous wisdom, sort of looking to the 7 generations and thinking in terms of that. Well, it's pretty hard to be short-sighted when you're thinking 7 generations in advance. What is the world going to be, that far in advance? So that's a reorientation. And Pope Francis talks a lot about that, right? The shift from a short-term to a long-term perspective as being at the root of some of the social and economic transformation that's required. So I think that's a really beautiful image. It also makes me think, last thing I'll say on this, of this phrase that the Lakota use, which some of you may have encountered before. I put it in the chat. Oh, and Tom, I just saw your comment too about Green Heart projects, health and environmental degradation stuff there. But this phrase, Mitakuye Yasin, if people are familiar with this, it's typically translated as all my relatives. And in traditional Lakota prayer, but also in Christian Lakota prayer, often, there is this, that it's the equivalent of amen. So at the end of Lakota prayer, they say, Mitakuye Yasin, all my relatives. And it is a way of connecting oneself with the entire world around all my relatives, meaning the plant relatives and the animal relatives, the whole cosmos being this kind of thing. And even in Christian, I saw this on the reservation when we would, I would go to mass on Sundays and things like that. Or at funerals, it was another place where this happened a lot, that even the, say a Lakota deacon or something like that would end a prayer and he would say, "Takuye yasin, amen," like, and put them together, because for them, this idea of being connected with all the generations of one's relatives is the same as saying a yes to God's will for the world and whatever it is that is being prayed for. And I think, again, that fosters this wonderful sort of relational consciousness and this relational way of being that is so different from the individualism, the self-centeredness, the ego-centeredness that Pope Francis critiques here. So yeah, I think that's wonderful. Other thoughts on this theme of, individualism and community and generations, or other lines of questioning? Right. Well, we have a comment from the chat. I'll bring that in. And I saw Maurice, you just unmuted. I'll do this one and then I'll have you come in. From Chris Harvey, who is in the webinar, said, the last statement that we've been discussing regarding teaching the common good and solidarity at an early age is so vital. But he has found that many young clergy are preaching so much still about personal relationship with Jesus, and little, if anything, about the common good, solidarity, subsidiarity, these principles. The focus, even during the pandemic, hasn't really been oriented in his experience, Chris's experience, toward the common good, but rather about, following rules and finding ways to circumvent, how do we turn this around? It seems to me that clergy is not listening to Pope Francis, is what Chris is saying here. And I think that that's a really, sad and true kind of concern. When I always ask, and of course in my classes I have people from all different religious backgrounds, but I'll ask, the Christian students in the room, has your pastor or your parish priest or your deacon, how often do you hear about these ideas of solidarity and common good and ecological responsibility in your sermons or in your homilies? And almost always the answer is zero. Zero of the people will ever say that. And I think, Chris, you're right that there is this really big challenge here. And I think maybe like Tom, who's with us here in the seminar group, has been charged by the bishop in the Evansville diocese to implement things around Laudato Si. And I wonder if part of that is, how do we get this into our liturgies? How do we get this into our preaching? How do we get this these ideas? Because often, and this is a tension, I think, in our Catholic tradition, right? Often people kind of have a working knowledge of the idea of solidarity, or they at least want to participate in charity to the poor. They think that it's good to give to the poor, and certainly it is, right? But charity and justice are not the same thing. Charity and solidarity are not the same thing. And I think that point often gets missed in these discussions, that we think we have created a situation where charity, which basically means like giving out of one's excess, right, becomes a replacement for fostering authentic solidarity and justice. It kind of doesn't lead to the kind of deep transformation, social transformation and challenge. And that stuff is hard to preach because there are people who will be alienated by that kind of rhetoric. But it is also our tradition. You know what I mean? Like when you read Catholic social teaching, there are no bones about the preferential option for the poor. There are no bones about solidarity. There's no way around it. And so the idea of sort of like circumventing these things, I think it's a real problem you're naming, Chris. And I would hope that our formation programs for people could include integral ecology, solidarity, these kinds of things within the fabric, bake that into the cinnamon roll, right, of ministry formation in ways that it isn't but that there's a real challenge there as well. So I appreciate that, Chris. Thank you. Maurice, please.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I got to be director of a house of prayer down in South Texas called Leb Shemea, which means listening heart. And I want to thank you for putting that into practice, especially with your story about being there on the Pine Ridge Reservation. They were inviting you to listen and not come with ready-made solutions. And so just as you're describing your experiences there, we're looking at what the Pope is saying in terms of our relations with the indigenous peoples. Yeah, you know, the same is true for missiology. Same is true for enculturation. As a former missionary oblate, I learned that in an early stage. I wasn't going to bring Jesus to these indigenous peoples. He beat me there a long time ago. What do I have to learn from them regarding God and God's goodness?
Yeah.
Yeah, and just their own rituals of like the sweat lodge. It's not about a sense of time, like a 1 hour liturgy, and we have to be impatient after 60 minutes. They have a whole different sense of time. And I think that's that broader vision, that broader perspective that the Pope is calling us to. You know, what's a ritual we have that Miriam McGillis came up with, the story of the universe or the cosmic walk, that somehow gets at that timelessness, or that certainly is what the Pope calls for effective pedagogy.
Mm-hmm.
That broader perspective, you know, the timeline of the universe that God's been creating for a long time. And yeah, we do need to listen. So thanks for your listening heart.
Oh, thank you, Maurice. Yeah. Yeah, and I think this idea of listening to creation, you know, that so many of our Indigenous sisters and brothers give to us is so powerful, and so different from, I think, how often we're taught to interact with the world, which is, you know, come with answers. Even our educational system, right? Like, think about how when we go to school, we're expected to have the answer, right? We're expected to have the right answer. What is the right answer to this question? Well, one of the things I have learned, especially in the last 15 years of my life, I would say, is that I'm not sure that there is a right answer most of the time, right? There is discernment. There is space for reflection. There is time, space for taking the time to listen and to process and to be present and take it all in, and then say, you know, what is it that God is really calling us to in this moment? That kind of response. What is the proper Christian response to this moment? I think that is what Pope Francis is inviting us into. And in that sense, back to kind of Barbara's comment, I think that the answer to that is almost always more radical than we expect it to be. And the reason for that is because the love of Christ, you know, the love of God that is proclaimed by Jesus Christ is always more radical than anything that this world can kind of suggest to us or give to us. And when we listen, when we really listen, it just changes the whole game. And I say that, and I appreciate that you were like, thank you for your listening heart. But I also want to say, I feel like a novice at listening, even now, you know. This is something we're always, especially as a scholar, you know, like I always joke, academics love to hear themselves talk, right? Even we are trained to have answers to pressing questions. That's why I'm teaching this class, supposedly, right? But do I really have the answers to anything? Do I have the answer to, you know, the challenge of paragraph 155? No, but I do want to listen, and I do want to discern, and I do want to try to be in that posture. And I think if maybe this gets back to kind of, you know, Chris's point too in the Q&A, that you know, I was just talking about to one of my colleagues, Julie Rubio, about this earlier, and I said, you know, so often our church doesn't teach discernment. It teaches the rules. It teaches the right and wrong way, and it teaches us about sin and alienation from God. Doesn't teach us to live with the Holy Spirit in a posture of authentic discernment that opens us up to new possibilities. And so I wonder, like, what if our preaching and our teaching and our formation and our Sunday school and our, you know, RCIA, you know, as we're preparing for Easter, all of these facets of our lives, our prayer, could be oriented toward teaching people authentic discernment, an authentic way of being in relationship with God that opens us up to discover for ourselves and for our world the radical ways that we're being called to love. To me, that's the essence of Christianity. Now, I say that it's much easier said than done. We all rub up against the pressures of everyday life, but this call to transform our human ecology, to transform every aspect of our lives, I think that's really what Laudato Si is pushing for. And I love this idea. So Sister Phila Morris in the Q&A has said that the medical mission sisters in Philadelphia during Lent read a couple of verses of Laudato Si before Mass each week. And, you know, there's little practices like that that we can do, you know, to bring this in and to sort of just like put it there, you know, and people will say, what is this? You know, what is this I'm hearing? Who is this? And they find out it's Pope Francis and they're like, oh, what? You know, it can't be, you know, but these challenges that present. One of the things, because I've been working here at the university as the interim liturgy and music coordinator this year, as we're awaiting the next director to start, I'm responsible for writing the intercessions of the universal prayer, the petitions. They have prayer of the faithful, 9,000 names now, right? But I'm responsible for writing the universal prayer every week. And every week I try to find at least 2 occasions to mention a tree or an animal or a natural sort of other than human object, and also to ensure that when we talk about solidarity, so first to ensure that the prayers talk about solidarity and that they talk about solidarity with creation. That's an easy lift for any parish to say every week in our universal prayer, we're going to talk about solidarity with creation. There are easy ways to work it in. You can talk about God's love for the oaks or for whatever it is that's in your natural environment locally, right there in the universal prayer, because it's one of the greatest places that we, as the whole church, have control over the intentions that we raise. Those are written by someone every week, and can be used to talk about these things. So that's one way I've been trying to do this. And I love the suggestion from Sister Morris as well, about like finding ways to bring this text into the public eye. So anyhow, that brings us about to the end of our time for today. Thank you for another wonderful, rich discussion. The next chapter, chapter 5, which I think might be the, oh, Tom, thank you. I'm glad that here you all are doing this too. And I'll drop, Bonnie has a comment as well here, that I will send out to everyone, about a great TED Talk on donut economics. There you go, from Kate Rayworth there. So check that out as well. It's a great thing you can watch later on tonight or sometime this week. But next chapter is on lines of action and approach, and it's going to talk about political and social and economic and personal responses. Now, if this is the vision, if integral ecology is the vision, how do we start moving toward practice? Well, that's where we're going next. And then our final chapter will be on spirituality when we get to chapter 6, 2 weeks from now. All right. Blessed Holy Week and Easter, everybody. And I shall see you next week. Thank you for another great session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.